The crossing did not begin with a death omen. It began with a stone no one had turned over for 177 years. The Uncrossed. Case File TX-002. Subject, Nighe. The mother whose name a stone kept when no record would. The crossing did not begin with a cry. It began with a stone no one had washed clothes on for 177 years. In April 2024, CO Mun-ha walked into an abandoned clachan in the central Sutherland Highlands, following a single hand-copied page from a Parish session minute book in a town 2 glens away. The page carried no name and no date of death. It carried 4 words written in a clerk's hand. Mother. Died unrecorded. Mun-ha located the abandoned clachan on the second morning of her walking survey. She crossed the broken dike wall. She walked along the burn that ran past the foundations of the cottages. She walked toward the flat broad stone at the bend of the burn, where the women of a Highland clachan in this region would have washed clothes for a century before the clearances. She found the washing stone on the second pass. The stone was intact. The stone was dry. Beneath the stone, wrapped in peat and old linen, were 3 things. A single length of black braid horsehair thread. A small bone pin from a woman's shawl. A folded square of linen pressed flat by the weight of the stone for what Mun-ha would later mark in her case file as 177 years. The Uncrossed. Case File TX-002. Subject, an unnamed mother of an abandoned Sutherland clachan, attributed by surrounding glens to the Nighe folkloric category. Field Investigator, CO Mun-ha. Field Investigator of Unfinished Crossings. Date of Recovery, April 2024. The stone was dry. Mun-ha noted in her field record, the stone had not been washed at since the year the mother died. The water had passed it. No hands had returned to it. Mun-ha had not come to the Sutherland Highlands to find Nighe. She had come to follow a pattern she had been reconstructing for 14 months across 3 categories of 19th century Highland record. The first category was the Parish session ledger. The session ledger of a Highland parish in the 1840s and 1850s recorded baptisms, marriages, communion attendance, and burials. It did not always record cause of death, particularly for women who died in childbirth in clachans that had been depopulated by clearance and that no longer had a resident midwife or a resident kirk session elder to attend the burial. The second category was the clearance-era estate notebook. The estate notebook recorded which households had been issued removal notices, which had been resettled to coastal townships, and which had been left in place. It did not record the names of the women in those households. The third category was the women's oral lament. The lament tradition of the Highlands, recorded later by Alexander Carmichael in the volumes of Carmina Gadelica between 1860 and 1900, preserved fragments of women's funeral songs that the official record had not preserved. The fragments often named the women the parish had not named. Mun-ha had cross-referenced these 3 categories for 14 months and reconstructed a possible pattern. In a band of central Sutherland clachans depopulated between 1819 and 1855, 23 possible cases appeared in her reconstruction in which a woman had died in childbirth without having her cause of death recorded in the parish ledger. Of those 23, only 4 were named in the women's oral lament fragments. Of those 4, only 1 was named in a fragment that also gave a clachan, a date, and a description of where she had been found. The clachan was the one Mun-ha would walk into in April 2024. The date was a night in the late autumn of 1847. The description was 11 words. She fell on the path between the door and the burn. The night the mother died, the clachan had already been losing households for 28 years. The first wave of removal notices had been issued in 1819. By 1847 the clachan held 7 occupied cottages. The mother lived in the second cottage from the burn end of the row. She was 26 years old. She was in her 4th pregnancy. 2 of her previous pregnancies had ended in stillbirths. 1 had survived. The surviving child was 4 years old. The cottage was occupied by the mother, her husband, the 4-year-old child, and the husband's elderly aunt. The midwife who would normally have attended the birth had been resettled to a coastal township in 1843. The kirk session elder who would normally have recorded the birth had been reassigned to a parish 2 glens to the south. The labor began in the late afternoon of an autumn day in 1847. The labor was difficult. The husband walked the 4 miles to the next clachan to seek the help of any woman who had attended a birth. He returned at dusk with no one. The aunt had been present in the cottage when the labor began but had become unable to assist after the 3rd hour. By full dark, the mother was bleeding more than the aunt had seen any woman bleed in any prior birth. The mother left the cottage on her own feet at some point in the second half of the night. She did not say where she was going. She walked the path that led from the cottage door to the washing stone at the bend of the burn. She fell on the path. She did not reach the stone. She did not reach the water. The aunt found her at first light, on the path between the door and the burn, with the unborn child no longer living. The aunt covered her with a shawl. The husband returned from his second journey to the next clachan an hour later. He carried the mother and the child back to the cottage. They were buried together 2 days later, at the unmarked corner of the clachan's small burial ground, by the surviving men of the 7 cottages. There was no clergyman present. There was no record entered. In the weeks following the mother's death, the parish record did not record her cause of death. The parish record did not record her name. The parish record did not record the burial. The omissions were not the result of a decision. The session ledger of the parish for the year 1847 contained the standard categories of entry. Cause of death was a column the ledger contained. Name of the deceased was a column the ledger contained. Place of burial was a column the ledger contained. The columns for the mother's death were left blank. The blank lines were not crossed out. They were not annotated. They were not marked as awaiting confirmation. They were left as blank lines among the other entries of the year. The clearance-era estate notebook for the surrounding district recorded that the clachan held 7 occupied cottages at the start of the year and 6 occupied cottages at the end of the year. It did not record which cottage had been vacated, or why. The household record of the cottage itself did not survive. The cottage was abandoned by the husband and the surviving child within 4 months of the mother's death. The husband moved with the surviving child to a coastal township 16 miles to the east, where he took employment in the kelp industry. The aunt died of fever in the same coastal township the following winter. None of the 3 remaining adults who had known the mother by name carried her name into a record that survived. The husband did not enter her name in any subsequent church record. The aunt did not name her in any conversation that was later remembered by other adults. The surviving child, who had been 4 years old at the time, did not retain her mother's first name into adulthood. There was no villain in the omission. There was no decision to forget. There was no act of erasure that could be traced to any single person, household, or institution. The parish ledger had a blank space. The estate notebook had a number that had decreased by 1. The cottage had been abandoned. The mother's name was not held by any record that survived. The omission was not a wound made by a hand. It was a gap that had simply been allowed to widen until no one was left to close it. The word the surrounding glens used for women like the mother, in the years that followed her death, was being Nighe. The word appears in late 19th century Highland ethnographic literature as a folkloric category. John Gregerson Campbell, in his Superstitions of the Highlands and Islands of Scotland published in 1900, defined the being Nighe as the spirit of a woman who had died in childbirth before completing her household labor, who could be encountered washing the linens of the soon-to-die at a ford or burn at twilight or before dawn. Alexander Carmichael, in the volumes of Carmina Gadelica collected between 1860 and 1900 and published from 1900 onward, recorded fragments of women's funeral songs in which the being Nighe was named as a presence the singing women had encountered, listened to, and sometimes addressed by name. The category was stable. The category was widely shared across Highland glens. The category was used. In the case file Mun-ha reconstructed for the mother who died on the path in the autumn of 1847, the category arrived first as oral testimony. The recovered narrative suggests that a husband from a household 2 clachans to the south reported to a session elder, 6 months after the mother's death, that he had heard a woman washing at the burn at the abandoned clachan in the hour before dawn. The session elder did not record the report in the session ledger. He repeated the report to his wife. His wife repeated it to other women at the next communion gathering. Within a year the abandoned clachan was understood by the surrounding glens to be a place where being Nighe had appeared. The folkloric category was not malicious. The folkloric category did not accuse anyone. The folkloric category was, in the structure of Highland women's oral tradition, a way of acknowledging that a woman had died in a manner that the parish had not been able to record and that the household had not been able to mourn in public. The category preserved the encounter. The category did not preserve the name. In the case Mun-ha reconstructed, the category became the only public language that referred to the mother at all. The parish ledger had no entry. The estate notebook had a number that had decreased by 1. The cottage had been abandoned. The category, used by the surrounding glens, was the only word for what had happened. The category, used long enough, replaced the woman. The village called her a death omen. The records called her nothing. The first thing the case file establishes about her is that she had been a woman, that she had died in childbirth, that she had not been named in any surviving record, and that the only word the surrounding glens had eventually been able to use for her was being Nighe. First there was a woman. Then there was a death in childbirth. Then there was no name. And then there was being Nighe. Mun-ha returned to the washing stone on the 3rd evening of her field survey. She had spent the 2nd day at the parish archive in the nearest town that had retained 19th-century session records. She had spent the morning of the 3rd day at a small county museum that held a collection of recovered textiles from the cleared Sutherland clachans. By the time she returned to the abandoned clachan, she had established the case file date and the case file location of the mother's death, the cause of death as marked in her reconstruction, the absence of the cause from the parish ledger, the abandonment of the cottage by the surviving husband and child, and the subsequent attribution of the abandoned clachan to the being Nighe category in the surrounding glens. She had not yet established who the mother had been by name. The washing stone of a Highland clachan of this period was a flat broad stone, set at the bend of a burn or at a small ford, used by the women of the household for the laundering of linens. The architectural type is documented in the Royal Commission on the Ancient and Historical Monuments of Scotland survey volumes for Sutherland and the broader Northwest Highlands. The washing stone of the abandoned clachan was set at the inner bend of the burn, 3 steps from the path that led from the cottage door to the water. The stone was intact. The stone was dry. Mun-ha did not wash anything at the stone. She did not place a vessel on the stone. She did not light a candle at the stone. She knelt at the stone on the cottage side, the side from which the mother had walked the path. She lifted the corner of the stone with both hands. The stone was heavier than she had expected. Beneath it, in a hollow of compressed peat that had been packed by hand and that was no longer producing damp, she found a folded square of linen. The folded square of linen had been wrapped around the bone pin and the length of horsehair thread and was held in place by the weight of the stone. The folded square of linen was approximately the size of a child's shawl. The fabric was hand-woven flax linen of a weight consistent with mid-19th century Highland domestic textile production. The linen had not been laundered. The linen had been folded once across the longer axis, then twice across the shorter axis, and the folds had been pressed flat by the weight of the washing stone for what the recovered narrative suggests had been 177 years. Mun-ha unfolded the linen on the third evening, in the failing light, at the cottage side of the burn. The interior of the linen carried embroidery. The embroidery was worked in single-strand black horsehair thread, the same horsehair from which the recovered length had been drawn, on the interior face of the folded linen, in a hand that the textile curator at the county museum would mark as consistent with the embroidery training given to women of crofter households in the central Sutherland glens between 1820 and 1845. The embroidery was a fragment of a women's lament in Scottish Gaelic. The lament was 8 lines. In the case file Mun-ha would establish, the lament named the mother by her first name and by her father's first name. The lament gave the date of the night she had died. The lament gave the cause. The lament gave the place at which she had been found. The lament was addressed not to the listener of the lament, but to the mother herself. The lament asked her to remember that she had been a woman first, before she had been any household's wife or any child's mother, and that the women of the surrounding glens had known her name even when no record had carried it. The lament closed with a single line that the textile curator would mark as consistent with a known closing form for a category of Highland women's oral lament that was sung at washing places by groups of women working together. The closing line was 11 words. "We have washed the silence the living left, in your name." The lament had not been a curse. The lament had not been an accusation. The lament had not been an attempt to identify the persons or the institutions responsible for the omission of the mother's death from any surviving record. The lament had been a private rite of remembrance, carried out by the women of the surrounding glens in the years immediately after the mother's death, in the form of an embroidered text folded into the washing stone of the cottage from which the mother had walked on the night she had died. The Nighe of the abandoned clachan, in the case Mun-ha reconstructed, had not been washing the clothes of the dead. She had been washing the silence the living had left behind. The cloth did not prove that the legend was false. It proved that the legend had been incomplete. On the night of her 5th day at the abandoned clachan, Co Mun-ha conducted the closing of the case. She did not call a minister. She did not call a folklorist. She did not assemble the surrounding glens. She did not perform a public rite. She brought to the washing stone 3 things. A small basin filled with clear burn water. A single length of black braid horsehair thread. A folded square of fresh linen, on which she had written nothing. She placed the 3 items on the washing stone in the position in which the original folded linen had been pressed beneath it. She knelt at the cottage side of the stone. She did not speak for a long time. Then she read the 8 lines of the lament from the recovered linen. She read the lament in Scottish Gaelic, in the pronunciation she had learned from a recorded reading by a native speaker at the county museum. She read the mother's first name and her father's first name in the form the lament had preserved them. She did not ask the spirit to leave. She did not ask the water to release her. She did not perform any further word or gesture. She knelt at the stone and waited. Mun-ha did not record a visible crossing. There was no figure at the burn. There was no voice from the water. There was no movement of the linen on the stone. She recorded only the condition under which the case could finally close. Mun-ha had brought no instrumentation to the washing stone beyond the 3 items. She had decided, on the 4th day, that this case would be closed without instrumentation. She wrote in her final field note line that she had read the lament and the name and that what had crossed, if anything had crossed not because she had performed a rite but because she had spoken the name a second time after 177 years of no one speaking it at all. The clachan did not become safe. It became listened to. The Uncrossed. Case file TX-002. Subject, an unnamed mother attributed to the Nighe folkloric category. Status, closed by listening. Containment method, The lament was read in the name it had named. Field investigators' closing line: some crossings are not made by the dead. They are made by those who finally listen. Cross-reference. The uncrossed files document occult cases of spirits, grief, and identity that the official record could not contain. Each file is reconstructed by field investigator Co. Mun-ha from the smallest surviving objects of the case: a folded paper, a broken thread, a pin under a stone. The files do not promise resolution. They promise listening. End of file.